Welcome back to the Hive, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today we have a throwback show. We have a legendary AMA Grand National Champion. This guy was good, and he was a legend. And he is none other than the one, the only, Sammy the Flea Tanner. Sammy was born May 23rd, 1939 in Houston, Texas. He was an avid motorsports fan. He would go to the motorsports events. He particularly liked the sprint cars and the motorcycle races. First, Sammy was leaning towards being a car driver, the sprint car driver. He liked those sprint cars, and he was a huge fan of the legendary A.J. Foyt. He's a Texan too, and Sammy Tanner was a Texan. At around 13 or 14 years old, Sammy bought his first race car, a sprint car. And he tested it out at the local tracks, and he just didn't feel right about it. He was a little nervous about those sprint cars. So he turned around and sold it, and he doubled his money. Woo! At age 14, Sammy bought his first motorcycle. It was called a Viller James motorcycle. Have you heard of a Viller James? I have not heard that one. But he was racing the local fairs and races and events, and he did pretty good on that Viller James. And then soon he became a support class rider on the 500cc Triumph motorcycle. Sammy was riding a circuit during the summer, these fairs that had these motorcycle racers, the traveling motorcycle racers. And one day the announcer, while Sammy was racing, he said that Sammy was a rock and roll star from Texas. After the races, the fans swarmed Sammy, probably the girls too, and they asked for his autographs, and they wanted a copy of that record. And Sammy's like, oh, the record. And he was told about it by the announcer. And Sammy had one problem. There was no record. OMG, what are they going to do? So the announcer took Sammy to the recording studio, and they wrote a couple makeshift songs. They recorded it. Sammy Tanner must be a good singer. And they brought it to the track next week to hand out to all the girls. I believe I can fly. The Flying Flea was the name of that little record. I forgot what they call them, 45s. And that's where he got his name from, that record, the Flying Flea. And he was also called the Flying Flea because he was small. He was a little dude. He was only 5'4", 117 pounds. Soaking wet. Sammy Tanner was a small guy. However, being small has its advantages, doesn't it? All the motorcycle riders out there, you know that if you're small and you don't weigh very much, you can go really, really fast. Sammy Tanner came into his own in 1958. He finished 6th place in the AMA Grand National Championship, 6th place in his first attempt. That wasn't very bad. Sammy just kept getting better. The following year, in 1959, Sammy placed first place in the AMA points in the half mile. That same year, in 1959, there was a new track that opened in Gardena, and it was called Ascot Park. Do you know or remember Ascot Park? It was really famous. And Ascot Park was a really famous venue. And Sammy Tanner won the first AMA Grand National Championship race at the Ascot Park. Also, there was a race called the 8-mile race. It was done on the half-mile track, and Sammy Tanner raced that particular race, and he won that by a record 8 seconds. With all his success at Ascot, Sammy Tanner got a full factory ride by Triumph motorcycle, and he became a fixture and raced against all the good motorcycle flat track riders from 1959 to 1966. He was a good rider, and he won 3 Grand National Championships in a row during that time. In 1966, he won the Grand National Championship at the Ascot Park, and then they had the Grand National Championship in the United States with the top pro class, and Sammy Tanner ended up in 3rd place in points. That was very good. Sammy Tanner, he raced against all the top riders like Jack O'Brien, Elliott Schultz, Stu Morley, Don Hawley, and a whole list of riders that were really good. I'm not exactly sure how many races Sammy Tanner won at Ascot, but rumor has it that he won over 400 races. Sammy Tanner was an incredible rider. He rode against that wall and he was just an amazing rider. He could ride that bike like no other. That is why they call Sammy Tanner the King of Ascot Park. One of the cool things about Sammy Tanner that I like, that he was the first rider to wear white. All the riders back in that day mostly wore black. Why? So that they could hide themselves and so they could camouflage so the other riders wouldn't see them and they could pass them. However, Sammy Tanner, he wore white. Everybody could see Sammy Tanner. I guess that if you're in the lead, it doesn't matter what color you wear, right? Because they're looking at you in front of you. And Sammy Tanner was in the lead quite a bit. And in 1968, there was a shady dude, a shady promoter. His name was Dude Criswell. And he was going to start the revival of the modern day speedway. And he went to Ascot Park and was talking to Jack and Sammy and Don and Elliott and all these guys and said, hey, we have a speedway track over there in Pacoima. You want to come see us? We'll pay you some money and you can ride a speedway bike. The track was called the Whiteman Stadium, and they raced within this oval track. They made another speedway track within this concrete track, and they brought all these flat trackers from Ascot over there to ride this new sport, this revival sport called speedway. It was in Pacoima, California, and they called up Jerry Fairchild and they said, Jerry, come here, you got some speedway bikes? And Jerry had a whole truckload of 1930s, 1940s, old vintage speedway bikes. I saw those bikes when I used to ride for Jerry, and they were old. Those bikes were old. And Jerry got all those bikes off his pickup truck, and all these riders, they never rode a speedway bike, but they rode a speedway bike for their first time at the Whiteman Stadium. That was it. Speedway was on. Every Saturday night, I believe, it was during the weekends, they had speedway races for many, many events. They had team racing, they had the class, I think they had like Division C, B, and A at that time. They had all these great races and racers. Sammy Tanner was there too. And if we see some of these riders like Sonny Nutter, Sammy Tanner, and others that were there, we got to give them a lot of respect, because if it wasn't for them, we would not have the modern day speedway today. But Sammy Tanner was a very good rider. The following year was the summer of '69. It was the summer of '69. Yeah. And that was the year that Harry Oxley and Jack Milne started the Costa Mesa Speedway in Costa Mesa, California. It was the Bull Ring, and it was continuation of the revival of modern day speedway. They brought all those riders from the Whiteman Stadium, and they had a very big success at the Costa Mesa Speedway. It was the opening night of the Costa Mesa Speedway. Everybody was there. They had a full stands. It was really a great night of racing. However, Sammy Tanner was not there. He had a previous commitment. He said he was going to race a flat track race somewhere else, so he couldn't make the opening night. However, he made the next night, the following Friday night at the Costa Mesa Speedway. He raced quite a bit. He wasn't there probably every weekend, but he had a lot of rides there at the Costa Mesa, and he was a pretty good rider. Sammy Tanner raced 3 more years of flat track and speedway, and he did a pretty good job. However, in 1972, he called it quits. That was the last of Sammy Tanner racing motorcycles. Sammy's racing days, he purchased a distributorship from Arai Helmets and became a Arai helmet distributor all throughout Southern California. And those are good helmets. If you haven't raced with Arai, you better try one. They're a little expensive, but they protect your head really good. Sammy Tanner was inducted to the AMA Hall of Fame, Trailblazers Hall of Fame, every Hall of Fame. He's one of the most talented and senior members living today. Just an amazing rider. And if we see Sammy Tanner, we must give him lots of respect. A few years ago, Sammy Tanner had a party. He had a birthday party. He had one just a couple days ago. Happy birthday, Sammy. And a few years ago, he had his 75th birthday party. And he had a huge birthday bash. He had all the speedway riders, lots of his motocross, all of his friends, his riders were at his birthday party. And if you want to talk to Sammy Tanner, look no further than the speedway races. Just go around the speedway races. He usually sits around the bottom row and ask someone, "Where's Sammy Tanner?" And then they will point you exactly where he's at. Sammy Tanner, the Flying Flea. He was just an unbelievable rider in his day. He was an early day rider, and then he became an early day revivalist speedway rider. He's a lot of history behind Sammy Tanner, and he was just an awesome rider. If you win over 400 races at Ascot Park, you are the king. And Sammy Tanner was the king, and he's just a truly unbelievable athlete, unbelievable rider. And let's see, if we could describe Sammy Tanner in one word, it would probably have to be legend.